William, who's right here, who was the book designer and amazingly took on board the design process that we're proposing or presenting in this book. So what was really nice, it was a real journey with William. He was a great critic and a book designer and a great sounding board for us. And to all of our present and past members of staff, one of whom is here tonight, Fahad, and everyone we collaborated with, currently Rob being one of them. So yeah, we'll sort of roughly structure the presentation with some preamble, and I'll go through the process.
Okay, I'll preamble. So we first published this book in 1999. We had a practice in Hong Kong, and we wrote a very small book. That's about it. You could get it all on one side of an A4, but it set out this process, and it came from us kind of observing another culture in Hong Kong and observing how we acted to that, how we reacted to that culture, and we sort of set out this methodology to help, because we had a kind of turnover of staff who was sort of coming through and going. So that's where it kind of all began, and also in that book. So the first bit was all about storytelling, how to tell a story that's about place, and the second bit was all about nature. So this is a more sort of esoteric view of nature, but it was about us sort of saying, well, how do we interact with nature, and how do we take that to another level, or how do we bring the sort of poetry of nature into architecture? And then when we came back to London, we taught at the AA for a while, and we had students looking at seeds, and we looked at seeds because it was a good metaphor, but it also was something that had to perform, and something that worked, and something we could also show you how to build. And it led all the way to kind of built solutions, and we're very much about kind of material invention. We also then taught at Westminster and at Bath, and helped various people like Meredith, and at Cambridge, and other people around the place sort of teaching. So. But we also use the process in collaboration. This is some collaboration with Bath University and Foster's. Acorn was a collaboration about building super thin vaults to build office blocks with using a fraction of the amount of concrete. And then we also use it when we collaborate. So we collaborate with, this was AR Urbanism for a project we're doing on Gray's Riverside, and we collaborated with Robert Weston Williams for a project over in Walthamstow. Yeah. And then the research was taken a little bit further through my PhD, which was slightly longer than the one A4 page. And then the new book has then been kind of condensed down. But in the PhD, we did explore some of the themes of storytelling and of nature and of methodology. So the structure of the book is basically, the first bit explains the theory, and the second bit explains the case studies.
This process, which expands and contracts 4 times. The thread would be nature, people, place, but also this idea of a story. So hence you see us using the tools such as riddle, quest, archetype, and entity. And why we do that is because they are actually very useful for creating a kind of unity and identity, but also creating change and somehow believe in change. And architectural projects are all about change. And so we attempted to make a model of this process. Of course, it's a very 3-dimensional model of a complex process that tries to break down into simpler parts, but then rejoin them together in a thread of a story. So I'm going to kick off by showing you asking, which effectively takes the client's brief and normally comes in sort of words and values. So the asking stage, it remains in words. So we create a kind of word cloud, but we also expand and kind of distill the values that clients are sometimes implicitly, but sometimes explicitly conveying to us into something perhaps more physical, more in our terms and in our imagination. So the first stage, and this may look complicated, but it's in these 3 pillars: nature, people, place. And in each of the pillars is broken down into 4 different ways of looking at nature. So for instance, geography is the everything that you see on the land, including the topography, the geology, the biodiversity. everything about it. Elements, sunlight, rain, wind, they are considered as resources, but they're also such an array of sensuous delight and experience that we could harness as architects. Symbols, they occur in stories, and nature symbols are probably one of the best and simplest ways to convey identity and unite a group of people. And finally, lessons, structural lessons, systems lessons, things we can learn directly from how nature works and how it performs very, very well on many different scales. So you can kind of see how that works on 4 different scales and time scales and kind of physical scales. And in terms of people, equally, it isn't just about the people who are going to use it, it's also the wider neighborhood, it's also the people who are commissioning us and the project and their values, and then the wider world, the society, and what are the pressing issues of our society right now. So I think it's this attempt to expand each of them into something much broader, but also a sort of time perspective. Because often we're maybe trapped in the problems of what it is now, or rather a bit too nostalgic about what it was before, and that could be a bit of a trap too. So thinking about what it could be, and what it could be amazing, could be full of challenges, because the future is uncertain, but we've got to think of what's the best possible thing it could be. And that's true for all 3 pillars. So I'm going to show you one example of how this worked in one project, and often we sort of end up with a story that the process begins to tell us. The site, it was very disparagingly communicated to us as, oh, there's nothing but wind. And there's no reason to go out there. And the brief was actually for panopticons, which means a structure from which you see all around. But because there's nothing there, and the wind, it was a sort of prevailing characteristic, we decided to focus on sound. And after multiple journeys and experiment, much like the model I showed you before, and U-turns, we came to this idea of turning the wind into sound through these tubes that made the sound. And here you can see how we took the idea of a landmark shelter, broke it down into nature, people, place, and expanded each of them into 3 time perspectives of what it is, what it was, and what it could be. And so that is a very expensive process that we have to distill down and turn into a set of riddles. And you might ask, why riddles? Because actually riddles become provocations for the next stage, which is going to involve a bigger team, which I'll show you, and setting a sort of broad ambition, I suppose, for the next stage. And in the end, the project ended up on the map, and I think there is this kind of desire for every project that to become its own identity. And so this process really helped us find that.
We said our job was to put Burnley on the map, and then it ended up on the map.
So the second stage is looking. So looking is more visually based, takes the words from riddles and begin to elaborate on that, but involves a wider team of specialists. So we invite particular specialists come and help us brainstorm effectively. So from the perspective of geologists, biologists, ecologists, and we really sit around the table and think about the project, again, in time perspectives, but also in terms of what we say here is what is unique about this project, Nature, People, Place, and what is universal about it, meaning as an ecologist, what would you see as truly unique about this case, and how would you connect that to the rest of the world and other things that are more universal. So it sets, what we're hoping for is to then end up with a set of what we call quests. And quests then determines the next stage, which is the architectural bit, which is about form making and making propositions. So I'm going to go through one project in particular, which is the swing bridge. It began with a group of people very determined to create access to the islands on which these quite dilapidated but great one-listed dinosaurs were situated. And we brainstormed on what all these different aspects are, and when we came to the sort of looking stage, it gave us quite interesting things, such as, I suppose we're looking for oddities. So, for example, the way the islands were laid out, the whole project was a sort of edgy educational entertainment tool that the Victorians invented to educate members of the public about science. So the dinosaurs were created one-to-one, but also the islands were laid out in time, in terms of evolutionary time. And in fact, they mimicked the geology of those and the planting of those. So the whole ensemble, the dinosaurs in the islands were designed to together educate you. And hence, we had a choice between this site and another site. And we decided this was a better site, but also for budgetary reasons. This was a shorter span. It was completely community funded and sort of took a while to get the funding. So also after multiple brainstorming, one of the inspiration was this idea of the bony fish, because we are at the beginning of time, and before the dinosaurs, there were the bony fish, and also we were inspired by this idea of when you're designing, you're evolving a form, both in your imagination, but also as a response, perhaps to economy and to structural efficiency. And this idea of a very efficient construction method that, like a comb, that cuts out and folds in three directions to give you the deck, the balustrade, and the beam connection. And the undulation that we tested sort of 5 or 3 or 7 different undulations before we arrived at this kind of most efficient, most optimal level of undulation. And there, it's in the water. When it needs access, it's a very low-tech solution. You just pull the chain across and connect it.
The chain is padlocked.
Yes. I'm going to pass it over to Mike for the next two.
So when the architect begins, so I'm going to show you the Tower of Light, and I'm showing you David Walensky's photographs. David's just joined us, and he sent me some photographs hot off the press today. I'm going to show you in a minute. So this was a project for an energy centre and a gateway into Manchester's Civic Quarter. So you enter the Civic Quarter here, and the energy centre goes underneath existing railway arches underneath this bridge. And there are two parts to it, basically the tower and the enclosure of the energy centre under the wall, and a big window that looks into it. So it's a bit like the Pompidou Centre inside out. All of the inside is incredibly kind of brightly coloured, and that's where all the machines are. And the competition was to create a shield artwork for a flue. So they imagined some sort of dressing of a structure. So that's what they asked for. Well, our quest came from the idea of energy, and we wanted to make a structure that talked about energy. And actually in the interview, we said that, the sun doesn't rise in Manchester, which surprised them. But we said the earth spins towards the sun and rises into the sky. And all energy on Earth is kind of related to rotation, whether it's the rotation of nature, whether it's a rotation of a car or any other vehicle. Nearly everything about energy is about rotation. So we wanted to make something that was about rotation, so that was important for us. And also when we wanted to make something that was about strength in form, because that's what we learned from nature. We wanted to kind of reinvent the chimney. So we didn't want to make the chimney have a structure and then have a separate cladding. We wanted the structure to be the cladding. So this is the process that then ensued, and it's quite a messy process. You make design alternatives, you take a poetic and pragmatic approach to each one of the different things, setting, mass, circulation, and typology. But they didn't really apply quite so much here, because this is just for the tower. But then you make lots of kind of, you learn from nature. So the glass sponge is 200 million years old. Sponges don't have a brain. It makes itself just through kind of the numeric kind of reproduction of a beautiful structure. It's one of David Attenborough's famous. Bamboo's 40 million years old, and the cactus 30 million years old, and they're all capable of being incredibly tall and very, very light. I mean, shell-lace structure we developed in 2009. So here it shows you some of the experiments in the model. So they're not beautiful, they're quite messy. We're just sort of exploring things as we go, and everybody's making things. And we don't really know where it's going to come from, but we've got all those quests, so what does a design want to be? So that kind of sets a higher level. And then they all go into Rhino, because everything's done in plasticine and then paper and then in Rhino. So we explore, and then we finally got to the position where we said, actually, the best one is this sort of folded plate idea. And that folded plate just happened to relate to the structural device of shell-lace structure, which we developed in 2009. And that was another little book we'd done. And this kind of evolutionary process that we learned could do different things with very, very thin structures. So this tower is 40 meters off the ground. It's made out of tailored surfaces. And at first, the whole thing was only 4 mil thick. The tailored surfaces make it strong because they're curved and corrugated. So you take a flat sheet, you cut the flat sheet, you curve the flat sheet, you weld it together, and then you weld together the pieces. And so that drum is 6 meters wide, 6 meters long, 4 meters wide, and 4 meters tall. And then we made a series of drums that then have the flues in them. So those are the flues at the top there, and this is the circulation ladder here, and that's the maintenance deck there. So it's made as a kind of kit. And then the steel, this is the steel, and that's the young engineer. We did this with Arabs. That's the young engineer, Chris Clark from Arabs. And these two guys here are the guys who did the welding. They're both called Phil, coincidentally. And, but they were amazing, and it's incredibly accurate. And I didn't see this before it left the workshop, but that was what it was like before it kind of went off to get painted. Two of them fit on a lorry at a time, so it was very efficient. And then they get craned into place 2 at a time in the evening. And when we won the competition to do the tower, they then said the tower is beautiful, but actually the wall, you need to take the wall to another level. So they gave us the same amount of money again, which is quite a rare thing that you get more money. And they said, we want you to make the wall beautiful. So we talked to a local, the tower was made by a local contractor. We talked to another local contractor, Darwin Terracotta, about tiles. And they told us a simple thing. They said, when you make a tile, you can only use the mold 25 times before you have to make a new mold. And we said, does the mold have to be the same? And they said, no, you can change it as often as you like, as long as we can use it 25 times. So we realized we can make the shape change, we could make the shape evolve, because it was only in the computer we would just push it or pull it. So we managed to make the shape kind of evolve across the surface. And then these are all made as slip casts, and then they're finished by hand, and then they're put onto the wall. And it's all about kind of catching the light. And at night it becomes a kind of tower that catches light. And during the day, one of the things that was on that diagram were these gold reflectors that are about the size of this, and they're made out of gold stainless steel, and they blow in the wind because they're only 2 mil thick, and when the sun bounces on them, they bounce into the tower, so the tower becomes a kind of kaleidoscope of kind of dancing light, and that was the sort of intention. But I've never seen that happen. It's always raining when I go to Manchester. So making, we kind of, again, when we're making, when we're playing, we're looking for an archetype, and a story kind of, as an archetype, becomes a kind of symbol, and that's what kind of carries the project. And then when we're making, we know what the form is, we're actually now looking for the best way to make it. And you can see with the Tower of Light, it's definitely a relationship between playing and making. And just like asking and looking have a very close relationship, playing and making do. So we're often kind of going backwards and forwards from one to the other. So when we make, we kind of generally make a script. So we take the building apart, we take the archetype apart, and we split it down again. And so I'm going to show you this project in York. When you see a plan of a cathedral, they always show you the ceiling plan. That's because in a cathedral, you always look up. So this project's all about looking up, and it's all about the ceiling, and it's also about kind of radial light. So those are the kind of themes. And I just pressed it once. Right. Maybe, yeah, okay. So we break it down again. So setting, mass, circulation, typology, structure. Here it makes more sense because it's kind of a whole building, and all of those are broken down. And you say, well, how do I find a material and technique for the aperture? How do I find a material and technique for the structure? So each one of those is separated out, so we're kind of articulating each as a kind of journey on its own right. So if I just go to So these drawings are, they're new drawings and they're possibly very big, that's why. So here we are, so this is the existing garages we had to work with, and here's the mass. And they told us that actually the brief said that we should put the new workshop in the garden and we should put the apprentices near the city wall. And we said, well, that doesn't make any sense. It was in the city plan, but it didn't make any sense. So we said you should inverse those two, because 1 million people walk along the city wall, and so they can look into the workshop. And the last thing the apprentices want people looking into their bedrooms. So we just flipped it, and we won the competition by breaking the rules, which is always satisfying. And then when it came to the circulation, it was always the existing garages had a kind of an asymmetrical entrance. So we took that kind of pinwheel and just used that pinwheel to use the existing structures and kind of make the circulation kind of more fluid. And then in terms of a typology, basically we were making a collegiate building that's a square, but we wanted to make a building that was a community building, so we wanted to put a circle over it. So we put the circle on top of the square. So that was in a way of a typology. So that was the symbol for us. And then the circle is made by the structure, which cantilevers. The structure is basically a post and beam structure with long beams on 2 posts that cantilever at either end. Then the service, when you've got a beautiful roof, you don't want to see any services on it. So basically all the services are contained in walls. So they're contained in a thick wall like a castle, and they're brought to the inside of the plan. And then the enclosure, it's all about the roof. So when you've got a roof like that, you want to bring all the water to the center, so you can see the water, so you can collect the water. And then the apertures, each of the apertures is made according to the job it's been given to do. So that's the kind of system. It always makes a kind of whole system, so that's the whole system. And these are the drawings that show how the building, this is the wall where the 1 million people are. So we just lifted the building up the ramparts to walls so they can see straight into the workshop. This is the workshop, so you have a kind of clear relationship. And there's even a window here that opens so the sound of the stonemasons can go up to the wall, so you can hear the tap, tap, tapping. And then from here, we lifted the roof up this way so that people from the workshop can see the minster, which is just over here.
And this was sort of implicit in the client's brief. Many workshops, masons' workshops are closing on cathedral's grounds. So to inspire younger people to join the workforce, but also to reconnect the retiring masons, they want to engage members of the public to join the workforce. So the other part of this project is to get CNC cutters and this sort of injection of a younger workforce to regenerate this trade.
And here we work with Buckland Timber in Devon, who are the contractors. In all our projects, we try to have one detail that does as much as possible, because that's about economy. So that detail is there. It's just a simple bracket like this. You can get it from Screwfix. And it allows the beam to go up and down like this, to spin like that, or to move up and down like that. So from one really cheap bracket, you can make 3 dimensions. And then on top of that, which is a bit more complicated, we put plywood. And the plywood then makes a stress-kin structure, and it has a ring beam around the edge to catch all the edges of the beams. And then on top of that, it's filled with insulation. This is a reflected ceiling plan. So on the left, you're looking at the apprentice rooms, and those white boxes are actually their bathroom, and that's where the light drops in and becomes a kind of illumination, a lantern to the plan. You're seeing the circle inside the square, and you're seeing the rainwater that goes a simple way over the apprentice room, but goes a rich and complicated way over the master masons who are in the administration wing here, and that's the Dean's garage. And then we split the building up by putting over there all of the storage, over here the kind of tea room, and then all of the rain, as I said before, comes into the centre of the plan. So the centre of the plan then catches the water with catching the rainwater spout and coming down into these 2 rainwater harvesting tanks. And this is all made a bit like the shell lace from one single piece of steel. So this is one of David's recent pictures of the workshop. So you see, this is the city wall here. That's where all the people are. This is where the masons are, so there's a clear relationship. These are the windows that are pocket sashes that go down. And actually they have them open because they want to stay cool as well. And then the roof lifting up is how you see the minster, so you see the minster from there. But also, it keeps most of the sun out, but it lets in a little bit of a kind of crescent of light. And this is the apprentice wing, so that's leading to their rooms. They each have a bench where they leave their boots. and they go into their room. This is a fixed surface wall. Like I said, it doesn't touch the ceiling. And that's a plaster cast wall, which is opposite their rooms here. And outside, they have a bench on the inside for community, putting on of the boots, I suppose. And on the outside, they have a bench in their own garden. Each has their own little sort of cobbled garden. And then that's their room. There's a mirror here. That's why you're looking in a mirror. But then each one gets, it's a cell-like room. We were thinking a little bit of Laterette, where we got married. That has a sort of cell-like nature. So that's the apprentice rooms on the right here. And that's the roof that brings all the water into the centre. So it's about sort of celebration of the rainwater. And this is the rainwater that does a sort of loop down here. And then the courtyard is going to be green. And in the centre is a circle that is planted with wildflowers, but they haven't yet appeared yet, annoyingly. But it won't take long, I'm sure. But we're also planting creepers all the way around the outside. And then we're going to make a lapidarium. A lapidarium is where you take the fragments of stone that you take off the cathedral, they get remade by the masons. The remnants are then put on the wall. So that's what the overhangs do, they protect them. So the walls over time will just become more and more full, like Michelangelo's Capitoline Hill. It's just sort of full of stone fragments.
So this project is very recently finished.
Yes.
You have to imagine this is very green, and the walls on the right are hung with plaster cast experiments that aren't going to make it to the cathedral. And on those benches are sat people and masons and lots of people. So have to imagine these things.
I think that picture was taken on Saturday, David, was it? So, and then this is a view back towards the cathedral. So those walls will eventually be just covered in the stone fragments. So there we've shown you how the process kind of expands and contracts and expands and contracts. And I think if we find ourselves sort of working from first principles and really interrogating a project as if we knew nothing about it, then actually we're asking the right questions. If we kind of are looking at nature and looking at culture and bringing those influences into architecture, then we're looking in the right direction, I think. If we're playing with form that has a relationship to strength and has an integrity in form, then I think we're playing to find new solutions. And if we're making where we learn from the very latest techniques, we use the most available technology, then we're going to be making with integrity and value that's going to have longevity. And in a way, maybe just to sum up, in a way, what we're sort of saying with the storytelling and the nature is, we're trying to make a kind of creation myth. Each project almost has its own genesis, but it should just come from whatever the circumstance of a project, whoever the people are, whatever the place is, whatever special contact it has, they're always different, so the project should always be different. Thank you.
Wondering what stage from your structure that you've created do you often see most people miss out? From observing from, I guess, the architecture you see around you that you guys have not done, but what step do you think that most people skip?
First step, the asking the question. And that's so important because, and maybe didn't make this clear, you do that with the clients. You're trying to make sure the brief is the right brief, that the clients haven't missed any unturned stones. So
That's why it's called a brief, because they don't know what they want.
yeah.
It's a short explanation of a project.
And sometimes you have to expand it by a lot, meaning make it a lot more ambitious and thinking very, very long term. And I think it's the asking stage forces people to think past, present, future. And I think we do have a responsibility to build the best with the least, and that lasts the longest.
I would say the looking bit also is not really done by a lot of people. A lot of architects rely on architecture. And actually, I really like the idea that we shouldn't rely on architecture. We should actually rely on our imagination and expand the horizon of architecture before architecture finds its identity. And then we use architecture as a comparative device to find out if what we're doing is good. What's it like? How does it compare? And so I think the looking bit is also sort of not really, it's been done by some people like Friotto or Diesta or a lot of those sort of structural engineers, but it's not done. Architecture is held in too high a regard as the source of new architecture.
And actually, if you look at nature as a source, it gives you so many more time scales and sources of inspiration, knowledge as well as creative aspects.
So sort of this process within a direct commission or within a competition, I suppose when you're presenting your ideas, you already started that process to a certain extent. Whereas when you know, like for example, the direct commission, maybe you can start this process including the client, including the context a bit more. So when it's a competition, where do you start again once you get the project and revisit the process from the start? So you've done a certain...
Yeah, sometimes we have to. So the process looks very neat and linear, but actually there are many, many U-turns.
U-turns
Yeah.
and come back.
In quite a lot of invited competitions these days, you get a halfway stage interview, and that's where you can ask them questions, and that's where they can see how you're thinking.
Right.
And what we tend to do is we show this process to the people, the competition, and actually they see that. We did an expression of interest once, and we showed it to someone who was giving us some advice, and he said, "It looks like you're not interested." And actually that was a really good point, because we hadn't really paid enough attention to them, the site and everything. And he said, "Why don't you show them your process?" And so now we always do that. We always kind of give them back what we're thinking, and it doesn't because we call it a riddle because it's not necessarily solved, and we call it a quest because we haven't necessarily got there. So when you're playing, it can end up being anything, and actually sometimes the clients end up playing with us, and actually they really like that, because in that competitive process of which design alternative is right, it's like the sort of story goes into kind of conflict, and they get involved in that, and quite even in a competition, they'll come along midway and go, "Oh no, don't do that one, or don't do this," We like that, so we already hear things from them, so it's a good inclusive process.
Wider team, the two of you and the wider team?
Yeah.
And how do you take a leadership role in that? Who drives this process?
I think the story eventually takes that leadership, because everyone's interrogating it. And somehow, at some point, and probably somewhere during the playing, you realize it's the right thing. So it isn't, of course, different people are involved. So first of all, the clients, and then our own team, collaborators, engineers, ecologists, horticulturists, they all pitch in. But in terms of which direction, I think most of the time it becomes obvious, and perhaps because we do have some experience, 20 years experience, we are able to make those decisions as well.
But it's also, because it's quite an open process, we're not looking for a solution so quickly, because we're looking for a riddle that actually isn't necessarily the solution, it's a suggestion of where it might be hidden. And then the quest isn't actually, there's always more quests, and we always then make design alternatives, so we never have this singularity thing. And we do this kind of wall in the dining room, actually, with the magnetic, and everything gets pinned up there, and then we pin up ribbons that join things together, so like a detective's wall or a sleuth's wall, and that's how we kind of get the links, and then that'll lead to, we want to do this, we want to do that, we want to do the other, and those quests then quite often lead to, one might be about how you walk through the building and experience wind or rain or something, and one might be about how the building should be transparent, and another one might be how it's solid or something like that. But they're quite often contradictory to each other, but it's definitely done en masse, where we kind of, it's almost like they're on the wall and everybody then critiques it, and somehow the good stuff just comes out, And I act as the scribe quite often. I write down everything everybody says, because no one can read my writing. I have to then write it later. But it's because people just say random stuff, and what people sort of just say off the top of their heads sometimes is brilliant. So I think it's
in the
like the subconscious is the best.
There's a bit of stream of consciousness, wordplay and association.
I just imagine that it must be so difficult to create an environment where everybody feels they can speak in that situation.
You need a lot of biscuits and tea.
Lots of biscuits and tea, and a lot of honesty and a lot of trust.
Yeah.
And I guess, truthfully, there are deadlines, so you have to make that decision, and And that is a synthesis of many things. And it's also, it's definitely a synthesis, not additive, it can't be, because ultimately you're looking for a very simple and pure story, and then architectural language that's very, very clear.
You could use this process for anything.
You
Yes,
could
I
use
agree.
it for anything.
For anything.
Alex?
That's why I asked these questions.
Process, that's clear and I can buy into it. What I'm not enjoying imagining is how the cost control process and the coming to a contractor after you've made those journeys. How do you convince them? Because when I see your work, sometimes I think it's almost impossible you've got it done. How do you get them on board? The QS and the contractor, how do you get them on board?
I think probably the story again helps, because, for example, with York, there was such cost pressure, the moment of reviewing whether the roof should go flat, but actually,
The QS wanted us to make the roof flat.
and it would have completely killed the story, right? And a story that everyone worked really hard to get to, including the client, including the consultants. So I think the story really helps, because it's not, often people mistaken the architecture with style, you're just doing this because you like curved roof. But what if there's a real logic to it?
But I think it's also about collaboration, because I think, like the Darwin terracotta, when we knew we were going to make the wall, I think we looked at 9 different materials we could make it from, because it had to be fireproof, and like the tower had to be fire resistant. So, and we talked to Darwin, and he just made us feel very comfortable that he'd find, we told him how much we had to spend, and he said, yeah, we can do it for that. And then when we were with him, we worked out, he said, well, the optimum size is the size of a Belfast sink, because that's what they make mainly. And it says 2 people can lift it. And the optimum colour is the colour of a Belfast sink, so that's the colour it is. And so a lot of these things just come out of these really nice conversations with people who make things, where they tell you how to get economy. So they look complicated, but sometimes the complicated bit's done by the clever people in our office, not us.
Talking to them
Rhino.
Pardon?
Talking to them earlier helps.
Earlier, but when you know roughly what the form is, but before you've resolved it. Yeah, and definitely before you go to kind of tender. We didn't show Dover Esplanade, but with Dover Esplanade, what we did is we broke down the family of parts, and then we went out to separate contractors, because we were told we had to work with Ringway Jacobs, and the people who know the industry will know that's like a giant, and you think, oh no, we can't work with them. But actually they turned out to be brilliant. They had a great engineer, and they really endorsed the idea that we would go to separate artisans, and they almost did nothing in the end. They just managed all the artisans we brought, who all performed brilliantly, and we managed to make a project that was very complicated, wasn't it, Joanna? Well, we're on quite a tight budget. Joanna was the client, so.
Hardly, but on that side.
Yeah.
Thoughts, which I just would be interested in your comments on. One is that I think particularly looking and making sort of refer more to structure. When you look at nature, it's more difficult to look at nature and say organise a space, but structure and making things, nature's very good at. So just to comment on that in relation to the sort of engineers, and that's the same is true with servicing, I suppose. And then the other one is that, I suppose, which is linked, is that it's very poetic, your description, all the way through, all the words and everything. And it's almost like a story that pulls together these different disciplines that rarely make a story themselves. But structures are often prosaically described, for example. Servicing is very prosaically described. So do you have any comments on those 2 observations?
In playing, we say it's poetic and pragmatic. So you say you take the roof of the York project, and the poetic intent is to make a symbol. We want to make a symbol about radial light. We want to make a symbol about community. And so we want to find one gesture. Actually, the Historic England hated the idea we were going to make a gesture. But we wanted to make something that people could kind of cling on to, an identity that gave it a sort of strong And that was both poetic and pragmatic, because it was very logical to bring all the water into the centre, just very gently. And it also gave us a kind of big overhang area that would protect all of us. So there were all sorts of conflicting forces. But in the end, it's some. But, you know, in nature, if you look at nature and say, well, why does the shell do this? There's never one reason. There's probably about 6 or 7 reasons. You know, and that's how I think with good design, there's always like, you know, maybe half a dozen reasons why something is the right answer. And when you do design alternatives all the time, that's what you get to. You get to, you know, quite complicated.
Your first comment was about looking and playing, being more
Yeah,
physical.
Making.
You know, makers
Yeah.
who make things are often you know, how the collaboration with those is pretty critical, I would thought, because they understand how materials work in the
They
way,
do, and
in
they
a more natural way, in a more
Yeah.
intuitive way.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they too are interested in the poetics of their material, their system, the texture, and what else it could do. If we said to them, we would like this to really celebrate the texture of rain, or you know, I think they would welcome that as a challenge, as part of the story.
And in a way, sometimes what we're doing is we're taking a simple craft like tailoring and we're just shifting it in scale. You know, and if you show someone a model you made out of paper of something that can be made out of steel, then you can feel of it. It's so stiff. You know, it's sort of that's an easy way of kind of bringing people on board. And you explain to them actually you don't need a formwork because when you bring it together, it's a
I've always loved the way your work is put together. So the making bit, I've always assumed is really consumes you in terms of exploration of how you translate an idea into what we finally see. I'm just wondering whether the 4 stages you're representing, if you were to make each one the size that is representing the time you spend, would it be equal like that? Or would one be much bigger than the other?
That's a really interesting question.
well, I think
Does it
they would. You know
vary
that
from
bubble back
project?
diagram there.
Definitely
This one here
varies.
would be about 1 centimetre. This one would be about 2 centimetres. That playing one, you have to go through the planning process. That takes forever. and then this one, the making one. But you're not often given permission to start the making process until you've got planning, because no one wants to pay you to go too far ahead until you have an assurance. But what you're doing is it's kind of clicking away in the background. How can we do this? How can we do that? But you do, so it looks like it takes a long time, but actually if you get the right artisans and all right fabricators, then the making process is actually the most fun.
So some of the last bit might squeeze
I think that's
early
right.
on.
I think
It's like the diagram would be even messier.
yes,
It's really messy.
for sure. So some of the specialists we get on board earlier might be a maker of sort, and you know, engaging in the history of that making. You know, perhaps it becomes part of the story. So yeah, I think some of the green maybe is in the blue.
Is
We
the
did-
asking process continuous all the way through?
I mean, all of it goes backwards and forwards. There's these constant feedback loops. So I think, you know, so you need to kind of say their separate processes because otherwise you'd never finish. And, you know, when you're a student, I think you can never make your mind up because you keep having other ideas. It's good. That's why you have design alternatives. You say, I just need 4. You know, when you've got 4, it's like, okay, which one's the best one? And then you start amalgamating them. So you have to have these cut-off points, otherwise you'd never finish. You know, and even when you finished, I always think, oh, I could have made it better. You know, so it sort of never finishes really.
I think once again, because it was this very curious line about climate change, respond to climate change, we decided to go quite far with that during the asking process. So we invented this story about 7 seas, about a thunderstorm, you know, and I think something that perhaps was quite apocalyptic and very powerful for something you see in the future, that this piece of landscape could really help with both socially and environmentally, you know, through the water management and through connecting to more biodiverse nature. Do you want to say a bit about the commencement on site, imminent commencement? Yeah.
Wasn't expecting to speak at all.
This is Chris from BDP. They're delivering Grosvenor Square.
Yeah, so I think it's been a really beautiful sort of journey, quest, I think I can steal your word. in that we've got to the point now where all of those themes have been sort of pushed back through the design to a point where the contractor is now fully embedded into that and sort of bought into that process. So that's starting on site hopefully next week. But as was mentioned, we've just got a few planning hurdles still just to tick off before we can. It's really exciting. It will happen sort of almost after a long process. It will happen quite quickly because the planting is all about getting it done in one season. So we close the park or the square for a shortest period of time and work with nature to sort of develop it on its timeline rather than sort of a more contractual timeline.
You find it, the kind of realities of practice, quite brutal sometimes, cost, quality, and planning, regulation. So it's actually so easy to forget the simplicity of a story and maybe the joy of it. And actually architecture is about imagination as well as knowledge. So I think it's so important to have the story remind you of that, and just having a very simple story somehow everyone could hold on to.
Say a few words about your upcoming trip to India. What kind of quest do you have in mind? Because they're touring, is it something like 15 different architectural colleges to give talks?
Yes, is actually to refresh our knowledge of how other ways of doing architecture, because perhaps I feel it's quite difficult with many of the we're in a sort of transitional period where we're finding new directions, and I think it could be incredibly humbling and also educational to learn about how other countries are perhaps leapfrogging some of the problems we're having here with the lack of leadership in environmental issues and so on.
And there's really interesting work happening in India, and the colleges we visited last year, we were there. It was fantastic, and they do a lot with water, and we're very interested in water. And we think actually those problems that India's had with water for centuries are problems we're going to have here. So we're kind of interested, we're going to learn.
Material scarcity, resource scarcity and unpredictability. So I think all those things, I think many cultures do it really, really well. But here we seem to be just throwing more regulations and not getting very far.
Yeah.
The privilege of working on this book with you both, which was really fun and satisfying. But something's just struck me a bit late, I'm afraid, which is you have this methodology that you've created, which is exhaustive. I wonder whether you are trying to absent yourself from the process. And as a sort of supplementary question to that, whether the result of all of your thinking and research should be inevitable. In other words, is the end result, should the end result always be the same, whoever has been working on the project? Or is it more personal than that?
That would be logical.
But it's not. Simply because I think there's a time and a moment when those things come together, nature, people, place, and they give you that story.
So, and the
it's
team in the
interesting.
office, and the fabricators we work with,
The
consultants we
chemistry
work with,
between
the
people.
client, and our client for your projects has been fantastic, and that.
That's why I asked the question, who drives the project? Because that person is going to monopolise that project.
I mean, the truth
if anybody
is,
is.
no, you're right. The truth is we have to drive it because we are the architects. So it's not about everyone making the decision, but everyone's helping to expand and yield the possibilities. But I think your question about could we be removed from the process, I don't think so.
Thankfully not.
That would be terrible.
Even if you've got the book, we're still reasonably good at it.
It is about that distillation of the complex thing, distillation into something much more pure, and I personally I'm interested in that. But maybe someone else using it wouldn't be, and it would come out
Because you're the
differently.
arbiters and you have to make the editing, you have to
That's
make the
right.
distillation decisions.
But actually, when we teach with this, you know, it's really interesting because the nicest thing about teaching for me is to get the students to crit the students. And actually, with the storytelling process, you know, you get them to say, well, what do you mean? You know, are you doing what you say? And actually, that's really interesting. So sometimes we're just sort of sitting on the outside, and you know, but the beauty of a story is it's autonomous, and sort of it has its own logic. And so yeah, it could be that it could lead to that solution, but. And sometimes the things that sort of creep in, like the funny thing like the comb on the bridge, you know, they're fairly random, and it's because we were at one point trying to make a gate, and we wanted to make a gate as cheaply as possible, and then we realised we don't need a gate if we put the bridge right in the middle of the water, you know, and it was a much better solution. And there was a really interesting point in that project which Anna didn't mention, where English heritage, because those listed dinosaurs are the greatest collection of grain ward listed structures in Britain, and they told us we shouldn't make the bridge too beautiful. And you can imagine what we thought about that. So,
Did you guys know about these dinosaurs?
Yeah.
yeah, they're quite amazing, but they're quite. But the kids get to them, and they climb on them and stuff. So they're a bit fragile. So that's why the bridge is in the water, and that's where this whole fish idea came from. But the story can relate to that.
And I think we'll invite to that point about what happens next week, you know, versus this week. And hence, like, when we talk about people, the collective subconscious, you know, what are the sort of prevailing issues and what are the concerns, that really, they definitely feed into the picture. So they would alter that equation, definitely.
Beautiful presentation. I mean, you're talking about the creative process, and we all, I think, have that wonderful moment when the project that we're working on has a life of its own, and people talk about that in all different fields. And you kind of have that, but you're recognizing it in a kind of interesting way through the story. And getting client in particular, or everybody, the team, the craftsmen, everybody, involved in understanding and feeling that they've contributed to it, or they're on a journey themselves. And then it's not just a standard thing. It seems to transform everybody's potential and abilities. So I love listening to the two of you. I look at that and I go, my God, I'm not thinking like that. You know, what's wrong with me? But it's like an interesting, every architect has a different way of generating that. But I love the inclusivity that you two have. And with Dr. Freud in the corner taking notes of what people are saying. You know, it's like, but it's amazing because, yeah, I can see that it'd be a nice environment to contribute to from a design perspective. So anyway, very nice. And I bought the book, so.
Thank you very much for an insightful, fascinating.